Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon to participate in this program as part of the Law and Democracy Speaker Series in honor of Veterans Day. My name is Ian Short. I am the Director of ROTC for Dartmouth, and I have the honor of training, assessing, and developing the leadership of 32 Dartmouth students who aspire to be Army officers after graduating. I also have the honor of serving as a company commander in the Vermont Army National Guard in the Army's only Special Mountain Reconnaissance Unit. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program. The Law and Democracy Speaker Series serves as a forum for dialogue and reflection as we approach America's semi-quincentennial milestone. That was not an easy one. Today's program is being co-hosted by the Dartmouth Rockefeller Center for Public Policy, the Davison Institute for Global Security, the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and Dartmouth Dialogues. We would like to welcome our virtual attendees who are also joining us today via livestream. For those joining us in person, when we reach the audience Q&A portion of our program, you can raise your hand and one of our student assistants will bring you a microphone. Please be sure to wait for the microphone before speaking to make sure that everybody in the room and on the live stream can hear you. As a reminder, Dartmouth is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. We encourage you to ask questions during the Q&A, but ask that you do not interfere or disrupt today's program, which would include preventing attendees from seeing or hearing our guests and moderators, or interfering with our guest or moderator's ability to speak or be heard. Today's program will be moderated by Erica Barks-Ruggles, former U.S. Ambassador to Rwanda and current Obachine family distinguished visitor and diplomat in residence, as well as Morgan O'Green, our Assistant Dean of Undergraduate Students for Case Management and Veteran Students. We are thrilled to be joined today by the Honorable Nathaniel Fick, class of 1999, former U.S. Ambassador at Large for the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the Department of State. He served from 2022 to 2025 as the inaugural U.S. Ambassador for Cybersecurity, Cyberspace, and Digital Policy at the Department of State, leading American diplomacy around the world on technology issues including cybersecurity, digital infrastructure, digital regulatory policy, and emerging technologies. Prior to this government service, he was CEO of the cybersecurity and software company Endgame from 2012 through its acquisition by Elastic in 2019. Thereafter, he led Elastic's information security business globally. He spent nearly a decade as the operating partner at Bessemer Venture Partners, and he worked with management teams to build great businesses. Nate was named by Fast Company magazine as one of the top 100 most creative people in business. And Endgame was selected by Forbes as one of the top 100 best cloud companies in the world. Nate started his career as a Marine Corps infantry and reconnaissance officer, including combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. His book about that experience, One Bullet Away, was the New York Times bestseller, a New Washington Post Best Book of the Year, and Military Times Best Military Book of the Decade. His unit's experience in Iraq was the basis for the award-winning HBO miniseries Generation Kill. He graduated with high honors in classics from Dartmouth, where he later served for 8 years on the Board of Trustees. Nate also holds an MPA from the Harvard Kennedy School and an MBA from Harvard Business School. He is an avid outdoorsman and a registered Maine guide, where he lives on the Maine coast with his family. Please welcome our guests and speakers to the stage.
Thank you, Captain Short, for that fabulous introduction. Before we dive right into the questions I know that we're anxious to ask and that you all have as the audience as well, I just want to thank you, Ambassador Fick, for taking time out of your schedule to be with us here today. We're thrilled to have you back in the Dartmouth community, back on campus and into the Dartmouth community. So thank you very much for being with us.
Always a treat to be back in Hanover. Thank you.
Awesome. So I want to dive right into the first question. Can you tell us a little bit about your Dartmouth experience, your journey here? What led you to the Marine Corps, your call to service, and what were some common trends and themes while you were here as a student?
So I showed up here in 1995, which is a very different world from, I think, where we are now. So I went to a talk at the Rockefeller Center, actually, in, must have been 1998. And the speaker that evening was Tom Ricks, who was at that point the Washington Post. He might have been at the Wall Street Journal still. I think he was the Washington Post's Pentagon correspondent. And he gave a talk about the Marines and an experience that he had with the Marines in Somalia a few years before. And I felt at that point a little bit adrift as an undergraduate. I felt like kids came in with 1,000 different interests and then got funneled onto a few paths. And I wasn't especially interested in some of those paths. So I joined the Marines. And again, it was the 90s. It was like a different calculus. But it kind of way leads on to way. And I was telling some students earlier today, I think careers often only seem linear in hindsight. But when you're looking forward, we're all kind of grasping in the proverbial dark room, trying to figure out the next step. But I've been really grateful to maintain a connection with Dartmouth, and it's always good to be back.
Awesome. And it's fabulous to hear that it's programs like this that really have made a difference.
Huge impact on me, certainly. Yeah.
Kind of changing directions a little bit. Obviously, technology is it's changing the world. It's changing our military. What are your thoughts on how it is changing the military service, how it's changing the skill sets that are needed as well?
So Mark Andreessen is a Silicon Valley venture capitalist. He famously wrote a few years ago, "Software is eating the world," just meaning that everything that we consume from a product and services standpoint is more and more software-based, software-defined, software-enabled. And I believe that technology in a similar way is eating our foreign policy. Every issue in American foreign policy, every bilateral issue, every multilateral issue, every functional issue is increasingly intertwined with tech. The war in Ukraine is a good current example, I think, where Ukraine's battlefield success against incredible odds has been largely tech-enabled. I think at its core, it comes down to national will and resilience and people, but certainly tech-enabled. A big piece of my portfolio at the State Department was providing our non-military tech assistance to Ukraine. I made 3 trips there last year, and we were responsible for the cyber defense of Ukraine. We were responsible for providing Ukraine with satellite communications, which has been really decisive, I think, in their ability to fight. And make no mistake, I mean, what's happening in Ukraine isn't going to stay in Ukraine. It's the proving ground and increasingly the foundry for the technologies that are going to matter in every other conflict, current and future. So I think that, like it or not, was it Plato who wrote, "You may not be interested in war, but war's interested in you." You may not be interested in tech, but tech's interested in you. And so, you know, in all these organizations, especially big government organizations that might be slow to change, and I credit our boss, our last boss, Tony Blinken, with being really good at this, kind of setting the tone from the top that we have to get comfortable with this. Nobody would walk into a meeting at the State Department and say, "I don't know anything about this China stuff," or "I don't know anything about this human rights stuff." But people still feel like it's okay to walk in and say, "I don't know anything about this tech stuff. My granddaughter taught me how to use my iPad." It's actually, that's not going to cut it anymore, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to Erica for some more questions.
Yeah, that's a great segue into your service as a civilian. First of all, let me say thank you for your service to our country in multiple roles. It's always a pleasure working with people from the military, and I would be remiss in not recognizing the close cooperation that the military and the State Department have, not only at the pointy end of the spear of national security, but together overseas. So as you joined the State Department after a career in the private sector, how did that look, having served in a different capacity? And what was it like setting up a new bureau in the State Department with all the bureaucratics that involves, but also with the exciting issues that CDP was dealing with.
Well, thanks for highlighting the relationship between the military, particularly the Marine Corps, and state.
Yep.
One of the real joys for me in the role at state was everywhere I went, and I went to 50-some countries or something in the 2.5 years, I'd meet with the Marines who there's a detachment of Marines at every U.S. embassy around the world, and I shot pool with the Marines in Albania and went running with the Marines in Beijing and did push-ups in the gym with the Marines in Santiago, and I always tried to spend time with the Marines, which meant more to me, I think, than it did to them. But I'm grateful to them. So I pretty quickly reached the conclusion that I think people who've been around state for a long time reach, which is the place is quite consensus-driven and not always as fast as it needs to be. Yep. So I had to deal with my boss, the secretary, and said, look, I need a steer from you. If you really want to get something done, I will get it done. And there's going to be a little bit of broken glass and maybe some blood on the floor, but we'll get it done. And if instead you want me to focus on institution building and being an institutionalist on a particular issue, then we'll take that tack. And so it was a little bit of a judgment call, but I'll give you one example of getting stuff done. Given that tech is so foundational to our foreign policy now, we thought it made sense to have a dedicated, trained tech officer in every American mission around the world. Yep. And set a goal of doing that at 190 missions in about a 2-year period, which was pretty aggressive. Yep. But we got a training course set up at the Foreign Service Institute in Arlington. We got the throughput going to get people through. We offered them one a year in Arlington, and then we moved them around regionally in different parts of the world. And I went to our boss and I said, sir, do you really want to get this done? And he said, I do. So then I did a CNN interview and said, the State Department has decided to put a trained tech officer in every embassy around the world by the end of 2025. And that got the bureaucracy moving in ways that maybe it wouldn't have done organically.
Pushing the bureaucracy is often a more of an art form than people realize, figuring out what tools to use.
Indeed.
So with this intersection of tech and national security that you were talking about, it's no longer acceptable to not be able to talk about tech. What should the U.S. be doing now to start thinking around the corners for the issues ahead? Particularly, how do we deal with what's coming, or some predictors coming with China? Yeah. And how do we manage competition versus conflict?
Yeah. I said this to students earlier, so for those for whom it's repetition, I apologize. But I think self-fulfilling prophecies, that's a real thing. I think we always have to distinguish between people and governments and not paint with too broad a brush. But my view, and the view I think of most of us who are working on these issues, and including actually people who are still working on these issues, there's actually quite a lot of continuity in this area across administrations. That shared view is that there is a significant global competition underway. And in the technology sphere, which I think is one of the primary, maybe the primary battleground of that competition, I would describe it as a generally multi-stakeholder, generally organic, generally bottom-up, generally inclusive, generally rights-respecting, all of these things qualified with generally, approach to technology development, deployment, and use. And then a much more authoritarian, centralized, top-down, statist approach. And if you tease the threads out and say, okay, what world do we want to live in? I definitively want to live in the former, as imperfect as it is. And the really big ideas are at stake here. And I mean the really foundational ideas, like representative government and free markets and equal treatment of all people, imperfect as it is, but the aspiration. And I think tech's that battleground. And the Chinese are running a very concerted cybersecurity campaign against us that involves IP theft and personal data aggregation to build a social graph of Americans, and planting access capabilities in our critical infrastructure that allows them to do destructive things in the event of a contingency. They are running a very concerted playbook of IP theft and state subsidies to get digital infrastructure deployed around the world. Undersea cable, wireless telecom, data centers, all of that. And they're in many cases winning kind of a hearts and minds PR battle across much of the global south, the developing world, whatever term you use, in ways that's troubling.
Yeah. Well, you and I saw a little bit of this when we were doing. It wasn't hand-to-hand combat. It was more. It was more drink to food to drink to food combat.
So can I comment on that just for a second?
Yes, please.
One of the concepts in the military that I really appreciated was this idea of the last 100 yards.
Yeah.
Where you've got this $1 trillion enterprise behind you, and millions of people and 250 years of history, and it all comes together. But at that point, sometimes it's a few people with rifles, and 100 yards away, a few other people with rifles, and it's all right there.
Yep.
Secretary Blinken used to talk about the last 3 feet, which is its diplomatic equivalent, where
Exactly.
you get 250 years of history and a huge amount of culture and all these norms and all these people and these institutions. But you walk into a room and you shake somebody's hand and you look them in the eye and you sit down across the table.
Yep.
And it's combat by other means, and you're trying to get to some shared outcome, and they're actually quite similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in that last 3 feet concept, you and I did a lot of kind of trying to lay the foundations for how do we think about governing AI, and how do we start building a global consensus. Where do you see that going, and how do we bring the private sector along on that? And how do we bring the skeptics along on that, the skeptical countries that we need to support us? The hearts and minds, Africa, Latin America, Asia countries that are getting support from China, but we need them to work with us on the governance issues so that the ideas war, as you said, the foundational ideas war comes out right.
Yes, there's actually an interview in the Wall Street Journal this morning with Michael Kratsios, who's the current director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, talking about some of the current approach that the US government is using in this area. And frankly, if you changed the names out, it's a very similar approach. I was in the ambassador job on the day that ChatGPT was released in November of 22, and I was in a meeting in Spain, and immediately went back to my hotel room and downloaded it and used it to write my talking points for my government meetings the next day, just to see how it did compared to the State Department apparatus. And it did incredibly well. And so it was immediately clear that this was going to be a game changer for us in so many ways. And it prompted a series of debates inside the administration, because every government in the world was saying, we got to do something. Okay, well, what are you going to do? And that was a much harder question to answer. And I think the approach that I argued for, and many others did as well, was that we really ought to maintain our innovative advantage as our North Star, that the wellspring of American security is actually American prosperity. And so we have to make sure that the United States remains the place in the world where if you're a smart kid, this is where you want to be to build that next company. You want to do it here. Because we have an immigration policy that enables it, because we have a tax and regulatory policy that enables it, because we have the foundational R&D, we have the education system from early childhood to postgraduate, the whole thing. Like, we know what the ingredients of a successful innovation economy are. So, and we've done them pretty well for a long time, so keep doing them. And that's why our initial approach was around voluntary commitments that the companies would make to safety, security, and trust in these frontier AI systems. So that was one piece of it, was let's not kill the proverbial goose laying golden eggs. Like, everything else depends upon winning this big competition, so it's got to be innovation first, not regulation first. You know, our friends in Europe took a very different approach with the EU AI Act, which was, wrangled into existence before the release of ChatGPT, and then they basically have spent the last couple of years refactoring it for a world they couldn't have predicted, right? And that's just not, it doesn't work given the pace of change here. And I'm not like an totally unregulated, laissez-faire, free market advocate in this area. I think the stakes are too high. Yeah. But still, innovation ought to be our North Star. With respect to allies and kind of persuadable countries around the world, I'm influenced here by being the parent of 2 teenage girls, where like when I pound the table and say my way or the highway, like I'm usually standing there by myself, right? So you can't force countries to choose.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Everybody has autonomy, agency, independence, their own political calculus. It's actually incumbent upon us to offer a better alternative. So we put a lot of effort into trying to not only like hector and lecture countries about why this is going to be good for you, but actually demonstrate it and put real resources on the table.
Yeah.
And real resources meant things like money for compute, access to compute. Yeah. It meant support for innovation, tangible support for innovation ecosystems in different places, not words. I think so much of the future is going to depend upon where the infrastructure build-outs happen and where the access exists. And we have a real opportunity to make sure that countries like Brazil, like India, you could spin the globe and pick a dozen, that they really have a major role to play.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. I'm going to turn back to Morgan to ask a last question here, but this is the warning that we're going to then turn to you all for your questions. We're going to try and make sure that we get to students first, but there will be microphones circulating and you need to raise your hands. And the key is the first question always gets answered. So Morgan, over to you.
All right. Well, Ambassador Fick, I'm curious, as we commemorate Veterans Day this week on campus and in our community, what message do you have for the veteran community, but also specifically the students that are here tonight, or anyone who has a desire to get into military service or civic leadership roles?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, someone gave me this hat today. That's actually a perfect opportunity for me to be my prop. In the 1990s, there was no such thing as a camouflage Dartmouth hat. It didn't exist. So, I mean, a few things. When I was on the board here for 8 years, probably for 6 or 7 of them, I had the privilege of speaking at the commissioning ceremony for Dartmouth students who were going into the military. And one of the points I always tried to make there was that Rick Atkinson wrote a great book about West Point called The Long Gray Line. I actually think at Dartmouth there is a long green line. There really is. There were dozens of Dartmouth students who fought in the Civil War on both sides, actually. 3,400 Dartmouth alums fought in World War I, more fought in World War II than the college keep track of. 90% of the class of 1942 was in uniform. And that tradition has continued. It's had its sort of ups and downs, but I'm a big believer in the idea that, this is a quote, I wrote my senior thesis here on Thucydides, so this quote is often attributed to Thucydides. I can say almost definitively that it's apocryphal, that this is misattributed. But the idea is important, which is a nation that draws too great a distinction between its scholars and its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. And that's a problem in a participatory democracy. That's a problem. That results in less good outcomes for everybody. So I give Dartmouth a huge amount of credit. The fact that your role exists and you're here is like a tribute to that. And so that's a sea change and really a good one. And I hope we don't lose sight of that we can argue about policy. We should never confuse that with the people who are implementing a policy and doing it in a nonpartisan, apolitical way. So I think that's really, really essential. And there are a lot of ways to serve. The military is but one. There are many ways to serve. And I think that for students, you're embarking soon on what is hopefully, 50 or 60 years of kind of productive career. That's a lot of time, actually. It's enough time to do a bunch of different things. And I hope that you'll, spend some of that time in public service. It could be the state level, local level, national level. It could be uniform or other. There are lots of ways to do it. But now more than ever, it feels to me like we need common threads, shared experiences.
100%.
Everybody's got to be in the same boat.
Thank you for that.
Great. Okay, so this is where we turn to you for questions. All right, I've got a hand here. See, first question, your first hand up gets the questions. Please say your name and which class you are.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ben. I'm 29. I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us. And earlier you said that one of the ways that we could gain an edge in this competition over technology is keeping America the place where young people go and share their ideas and create all like new inventions. And I wanted to ask, not just with this administration, but on a more broader level, how do you think American immigration policy either helps or inhibits that vision?
Yeah. I think that if you believe that we're in a big competition, then my view is we want the biggest, best team we can get. And look, fundamentally, like at a very visceral level, we're a nation of immigrants, most of us, right? And my own, it's deeply personal for me. My grandfather, his parents immigrated from Italy. He didn't speak English until he went to first grade in the New York City public schools. And 10 years later, he's a scholarship kid at Yale. And so like, after fighting in World War II, by the way, against Italians. So, that's sort of like, this is the American story. And I just believe intrinsically that we're a nation of immigrants, that it makes us stronger, it makes us better. And it's always been that way. There have been periods of, friction and recidivism and everything, but generally speaking, I think there's a pretty that's a compelling narrative in American life. Certainly in tech innovation and entrepreneurship, the huge portion of founders of technology businesses in the United States are immigrants or the children of immigrants. A huge amount of the capital supporting those businesses is invested by immigrants and the children of immigrants. So I would go so far as to say we cannot win a global technology competition over time without a steady stream of people who want to come here and build and support great businesses. It won't work.
All right. Students, questions? Yes, please. And then I've got two more over here.
Sir, thank you so much for coming to speak to us tonight. So I'm an Air Force veteran of 6 years. I was in the cyber trenches, and I saw firsthand what that world looked like. I have quite a few concerns in the past year or so of deconflicting the cyberspace and getting us all on the same page, because I've seen resources taken away from the efforts that are protecting us Americans, those efforts that are giving us that edge in the cyber battle space environment. What do you see as a cohesive way forward and the way that everybody can get on the same page, so to speak, to make us a stronger competitor on the global cyber world?
Yeah, so I have a pretty strong view on that based on the portfolio I had. And I think there are 3 buckets of things we need to do. And I'm not just pointing fingers at this administration. We tried to do these things and had some success, and this team will probably try to do these things and have some success, and there are complex problems and it'll take a long time. But first of all, we need to point the finger at the attackers and say that, identify them. In the time that I've been involved in cybersecurity, mainly on the company and technology side, attribution, the challenge of attributing an attack, has migrated from being mostly a technical challenge to being mostly a political challenge. Like technically now we can get there, and we can get there with high fidelity, high certainty, and pretty quickly. It's still really hard to get people to stand up publicly and say this was Iran or this was Russia. To do those public attributions successfully, 2 things need to be true. First, your analysis has to be empirically sound. It can't be a political statement by a government. It has to be an analysis by what is effectively a global community of security researchers who are attributing something. And then second, just like kids on a playground, you're safer if you're standing with others. So it's important to have not one government doing the attribution, but as many as you can get. So if you've got a bunch of governments standing side by side doing a public attribution with empirical analysis behind it, that's a powerful statement to the attacker. We need to do more of that. The thing I think we ought to do on the US government side is we've basically failed to extend deterrence into the cyber domain. Like, since 1945, basically American power and deterrence, and to some extent the nuclear umbrella, have created conditions of greater peace and therefore greater prosperity than large portions of the planet enjoyed in the hundreds of years before that. That umbrella, that deterrence, has essentially stopped at the digital edge, and our adversaries do things to us using digital means that they would never do kinetically because they know we would respond. So the Chinese aren't going to break into our research labs physically and steal stuff because if we catch them, we're going to do something to them. The Russians are not going to physically infiltrate our voting system and manipulate outcomes because we would do something. But they absolutely do it digitally because they know they'll get away with it. So we need to extend deterrence into the digital world. People will tell you that can't be done because of attribution or other problems. I disagree, because behind the keyboard is a human being. And in my experience, if you make it hurt bad enough for somebody, they are deterred. So we may not have the will or the willingness, but it is possible. And it can't be cyber tit for cyber tat, fighting offensive cyber with offensive cyber. It's got to be every other instrument of power, diplomatic, informational, economic, and if necessary, military. So that's the second bucket. The third bucket is just because a cyber attack has devastating consequences does not mean that it was a sophisticated attack. A lot of these attacks that have had devastating consequences have actually been quite simple attacks. And so we really ought to have more baseline regulatory requirements and expectations. And it doesn't have to be regulation. Norms and expectations matter here around what a company's security posture needs to be. If you are the custodian of a massive amount of American personal data, or you're responsible for some critical sector of our economy and society, you ought to be responsible for that. I mean, when Boeing cut corners and airplanes crashed and people died, it was bye-bye CEO and bye-bye most of the board, and bye-bye stock price. It was a, there was a huge market-based accountability for that internal behavior. That has not been the case when there have been big cyber attacks. It just hasn't been the case. We've sort of baked it into our expectations, so I think we need to reset our expectations.
It's a gentleman in the turquoise shirt, and then I have got.
Hi, my name is Kavneer. I'm a 29. Thank you for coming to speak with us today. My question is to do with AI. How do you think the goals of AI alignment play into the AI race with China and maintaining the innovation economy while not hampering companies and the private sector with regulation?
Yeah, look, I freely admit this is going to be a really hard balance. Like I said at the beginning, I think that our default position needs to be innovation first. Because we're not leading with our innovative advantage, then we're forced into a bunch of like artificial motions that I think don't work over time. I'll give you an example. So export controls on high-end semiconductors. The last administration, the team that I was a part of, imposed export controls on high-end semiconductors to China. This administration has gone back and forth, but basically now is settling out on seeming to stick with export controls on high-end semiconductors. I'm a little heretical on this point. I'm not sure that works. My experience is you can win one race by kneecapping your opponent. It's pretty hard to win 1,000 successive races across a bunch of different events by kneecapping opponents. You end up provoking a backlash against you, and people anticipate your kneecapping, and they compensate for it. So I would argue that in the long haul, a better strategy for us to maintain the delta that we need, if that's how you measure it, or we were talking about this morning, Emily Blanchard and I, who's also served at State together. Depends what the goal is. Is it a delta? We have to maintain a certain advantage over the Chinese? Is it we have to get past the post of AGI first? Like, you got to define the goal. But I kind of question the utility of the export controls. If I had to pick, and this is black and white just as a thought experiment, if I had to pick a defensive strategy of controls or an offensive strategy of innovation, I would hands down pick the offensive strategy. Like maybe there's a nuanced balance that is where we ought to shake out, but I think it's got to be innovation first. And then a whole other set of problems that's sort of outside the diplomatic challenge, but is definitely one for a democratic society is, like, how do we function in a world where now more and more companies have degrees of power and influence that for most of human history were reserved to the state?
Yep.
You know, how do you do that? I mean, the first half of the first round of trips I went on in this job were not to visit foreign capitals, they were to visit company headquarters.
Yeah.
That's kind of stunning, actually. It was necessary, but it makes me a little queasy to think about what that means, you know. And how do we live in that world? Because, look, they're imperfect, but we have checks and balances in our and accountability in our system. I have to believe the system's going to continue to function. It's going to be challenged, but it'll work. Those same accountability mechanisms and checks and balances just don't exist in the private economy, and that's fine if you're talking about, you know, most of what has been produced in the private economy over history. But when you start to surpass human decision making, it's a whole different set of challenges.
I have a gentleman down here and then the gal right behind you.
Hi, I'm Dario. I'm 29. I'm speaking here from my knowledge as a cybersecurity practitioner, but China effectively treats cyber offense as a, you know, like espionage, industrial policy, and like information control operation. And you know, it's an official state function, as shown by like advanced persistent threats being linked to military units. As we're focusing on you know, defense and incident response and ex post facto remediation from, you know, Chinese cyber actors, how long can that hold until we're forced to adopt something else? And if that shift comes in like more assertive or offensive measures back to China, is that even possible without losing our moral high ground, if that matters?
So I would argue that we are way past the point of where it's no longer tenable. Like, we've basically lost, you know, 30 years of critical IP out of the American innovation economy, out of our defense industrial base. We've lost, you know, all the personal data for probably most of us in this room. And vast swaths of our critical infrastructure are being held at risk, where you know, it is the digital equivalent of dynamite under a bridge. Water systems, power systems, communication systems, all across the United States are compromised. So we're way past that point. So now the question is, what do you do about it? And you alluded, there's this fundamental asymmetry where one of the good things, you know, we're a leading innovation economy. We have more stuff that people want to steal from us than we want to steal from others. And that's good, like, you know, but it does create an asymmetry. If the Chinese turn the lights out in a second or third tier American city, everybody's going to care. If the US, thought experiment, we don't do this, but if we did turn the lights out in even a top tier Chinese city, I would argue that there's not the same accountability to popular opinion in that political system. So the Chinese Communist Party is less sensitive to those things than an American administration would be. And then to your point, like, we do things differently. You know, there's a tradition of just war theory in kind of the American military, where things like proportionality matter to us and non-combatant immunity matters to us. And so we're doctrinally unwilling to do things that our adversaries will sometimes do. So it creates this very challenging asymmetry, which is why I think we need to look beyond, again, kind of cyber offense in response to cyber offense and be much more holistic in linking things together. I went to Beijing with Secretary Blinken, led a dialogue with the Chinese in Switzerland on Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, these attacks on our infrastructure. And I would say basically our message is not getting through. And so it's time to change the game. I think this administration is focused on changing the game. We need to be really careful that we change it in the right way.
So I've got another question over here. I'm looking at this side of the room.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a 29. Forgive me, it's week 9, so I wrote my question down because my brain is all over the place. But I wanted to ask whether you think the existing international legal framework is capable of governing like conflicts and responsibilities online, or whether like cyberspace requires a fundamentally new way of thinking about what state authority and like international norms are.
This is probably a question better answered by Ambassador Barks-Ruggles.
No.
I think it's a great question. I don't have a perfect answer. I will say, like, knitting together, my own lived experience in the Marines and the lived experience at the State Department, I would say that all of these arenas of competition have some things in common. The human conflict and the efforts by governments to impose their will on other governments, the tools are always going to change. They changed with the crossbow, they changed with the tank, they changed with the airplane, they changed with cyber weapons, they're going to change with AI-enabled autonomous systems, and they're going to keep changing in ways that we probably can't even predict. But the fundamental nature, the character, the intrinsic pieces of conflict are pretty unchanging, and they're ugly. And we don't often talk about them in polite rooms, but it's about imposing so much pain on your adversary that they give up and they change their behavior. The war in Ukraine is not going to end until either one side definitively wins, or until both sides believe that a negotiated outcome is better than the alternative for both of them. For what it's worth, I don't think we're anywhere near that point. And that's true in every conflict. We think about World War II sometimes with think about the good war, we think about the greatest generation. Well, the United States nuked 2 Japanese cities, firebombed a bunch of others, and bombed to smithereens, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, every urban area in Germany. Because it was a clash of will over fundamental points. And it wasn't going to end until one side gave up. And so I think we fall into the trap sometimes of thinking that cyber warfare is somehow going to be clean, or that AI-enabled, it's going to allow us somehow to fight wars without killing people, or fight wars limiting damage to civilians. I don't buy it. So war is going to remain, brutal and ugly and painful, and which is why we need a kind of a social contract that we go to war a lot less often, and we're much more committed to winning when we do.
I've got a question over here.
Hi, my name is Shreya. I'm a 27. Thank you so much for this talk. I have a question about food technology and innovation. I was wondering, considering the threats to the global supply chain of protein production caused by climate change, do you think that the U.S. will adopt new biotechnologies like alternative proteins, and will that become a new area of strategic competition like AI? And what can the U.S. do right now to keep up with countries that are further ahead like Singapore and Israel?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In the specifics, like in the application, it gets outside my area of expertise, but there are a couple places where I feel comfortable commenting. One is there is absolutely a shadow war already happening in agriculture, where certain fungi have been introduced, some parasitic worms, some like really weird stuff has happened. And it has not been happenstance, has not been, it's been state-sponsored, state-directed. But the agricultural frontier, not only for protein production, but just broadly for food production, is without a doubt a frontier of conflict that we all need to be attuned to. our adversaries are running a very similar playbook, again, along every area of critical infrastructure, and what's more critical than our food supply. So yes. The second aspect of that strikes me is globally we spent 80 years or something optimizing supply chains in every sense for cost. And a combination of this resurgence of geopolitics and a global pandemic drove home that maybe that was short-sighted, that we ought to be optimizing for more variables: security, resilience, trust, human rights issues in the supply chain, environmental impact, whatever the basket of true cost drivers is, we need to think more holistically about it. So we're in the early innings of this realignment of supply chains all around the world in every area, including food. And one of the things I always liked about the Upper Valley, and one of the things I love about where I live now in Maine, is like you have the wonderful opportunity to have a very short food supply chain, which is not true in a lot of the country, but it's true here. And so support your local farms, because you might need them a lot more than you think. Yeah, it really matters. And so I think it's a really neat area to focus on. So good luck with your research.
I had Sophia. No, we need it for online here. There's one coming.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm Sophia, I'm a 28. You've made a very compelling argument about innovation and how that's more important than sort of the defensive. But I was wondering about what the US government can do to mitigate some of the risks that come with AI, and specifically you mentioned how historically the governments have had sort of the monopoly on legitimate use of force. And so I'm wondering with AI, how can we mitigate risks like the kid in their garage sort of using AI for weapons and terrorism, and is it possible for the AI firms to innovate without giving all of those technologies to civilians, and how do you sort of regulate that because the technology companies are private companies?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I mean, the answer to this, for all of our sake, had better be yes, that there are ways to do this, right? So I think it's going to be a bumpy participatory exercise to figure out what it looks like and what gets codified over time. Again, we started with of the voluntary commitments. Voluntary because voluntary, by definition, inhibits innovation less, but they were really robust voluntary commitments in 3 pillars. Or shorthand was, we called them safety, security, and trust. Safety was what you're talking about, Sophie, right? So yeah. Safety was making sure that the models don't return the things that most of us would agree like they shouldn't return. It should not be easy to build a sophisticated bioweapon on your laptop. It should not be easy to build zero-day exploits on your laptop. It should not be easy to do a lot of these things. And so it is incumbent upon the developers to mitigate social harm in areas like that don't constrain any legitimate use case. The second pillar was security, which is basically putting some guidelines in place to actually secure the models from theft, so that these advanced frontier models don't end up in the hands of our adversaries, who will be basically unconstrained in using them against us. And then the third pillar was trust. This is, I think, the hardest one, actually. And the kind of core idea is users need to be able to distinguish between AI-generated content and non-AI generated content. Is that a chain of provenance? Is that watermarking? Like, what are the different ways you do that? I actually haven't heard a great answer for what could actually be done, but certainly we need to live in a world where people can distinguish between what's real and what's not. And look, it matters obviously a ton that some regulatory architecture is in place. I think in the meantime, what we can do is drive these voluntary commitments. We can drive the reputational cost to the companies. Like, I'll tell you, I was thrilled when our old colleague, my good friend, General Paul Nakasone, who was the commander of NSA and director of NSA and commander of Cyber Command, when he retired from the military, one of the things he's doing, he joined the board of OpenAI. It's going to be really good to have adults like that in the room in a oversight governance role at companies that are going to be this important. If you just tease out the implications, though, for a second, like think about agentic AI, sort of the next step in all this, where AI agents are essentially independently making decisions that humans would make, where your AI assistant is looking at your calendar, kind of knows your commitments, and is booking travel for you without you even asking. This is all coming, and it's coming soon. So imagine it in a national security context where you've got a data center, just to oversimplify it for like narrative purposes, let's say you got a data center with 100 million agents sitting outside Washington, and you got a data center with 100 million agents sitting outside Beijing, and 10 million of those agents are searching for zero-day exploits, and 10 million of them are building bioweapons, and 10 million of them are doing all-source intelligence fusion, and 10 million of them are doing strategic wargaming. Like, it's terrifying. And where do you want that? Where do you want that capability to sit? And those are decisions that we're going to have to make in like a single-digit number of years.
All right, I have time for one more question. This gentleman here, stand up.
Hi, Ambassador. My name is Xavier. I'm 29 from Singapore. I think one thing that I've noticed is that America and China has adopted, vastly different approaches to AI development, with America focusing more on a laissez-faire, market-driven approach, where China's AI strategy is one primarily rooted in industrial policy. I mean, hypothetically, supposedly, central planning isn't supposed to work, but what we have seen is that, I think Jensen Huang was quoted a few days ago as saying that China is just nanoseconds behind America, and China may very well possibly win the AI race. So in that context, is there an argument to be made that, America should adopt a more expeditious approach to industrial policy beyond the Chip and Sciences Act, and in certain ways emulate the Chinese? Or, is China's recent, developments in AI fundamentally going to be bottlenecked by their state-driven approach? Thank you.
It's terrific question, and if you forgive me for saying it, like so quintessentially Singaporean in its pragmatism. Like I love it. There's such a discipline of thinking when you grow up in a vibrant economy, participatory society, but a small state in the shadow of China. And my Singaporean counterpart, David Koh, has become a dear friend. I'm seeing him in Washington next week, actually. And I think it's a terrific question. And certainly this American administration is taking a more robust industrial policy approach, even building on chips and science. I mean, taking a stake in Intel. I mean, these are kind of wild moves based on the last 50 years of American economic history. I'd be interested to hear what others in the room have to say about it, or know more than I do. But I was at a dinner in New York a couple of weeks ago where I was very skeptical of that the U.S. government or any government can make bets like that in a way that's likely to be right. We just don't have much track record of doing it. I was surprised at the consensus around the table was very much against me on this, and that we're at a moment where actually the U.S. government is and ought to be taking a more muscular approach, really making bets, subsidizing, directing, and doing things that I don't think we've done in the U.S. since World War II. So I was, it's causing me to rethink some things myself, because of these people are people I respect and trust. But I'm skeptical, still skeptical, that the U.S. government's going to make better capital allocation decisions across the private sector than private investors will. But Singapore, in a way, has staked out a bit of a middle ground in these two positions, with a fairly heavy state hand in critical areas, but a deeply informed expert state hand. So I think this is one of those conversations now that's going to unfold in the United States and over the next couple of years.
Morgan.
Ambassador Fick, I want to thank you for spending time with us tonight. I know we could stay here all night and ask more questions, but thank you for your thoughtful insights and perspective, and thank you. We're grateful for you being here, and we're grateful for your service,
Still
both
wearing the hat.
in uniform and in diplomacy. And thank you to the audience here tonight. Thank you for engaging in such thoughtful conversation, and I'm hoping you can join me in one more thank you to Ambassador Fick.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.